Welcome back, everyone, to Issues of Faith. Our guest, Ian Morgan Cron. He's a best-selling author, Episcopal priest, host of the podcast Typology, and we're talking about the enneagram and his recent book, The Story of You. And so we kind of set up what the enneagram was in this first segment. I want to get into now, in the book you talk about 9 broken stories that we repeatedly kind of see among people, and they are developed in childhood. I guess, give us a sense of what you're talking about there.
Yeah, well, I think all of us understand our lives as narratives, right? And that are unfolding in real time. Now, we all begin to craft a narrative in childhood to help us make sense of our experiences and of the world. And the problem is those stories were composed by children, right? And if we bring those old broken stories unconsciously into adulthood, what helped us as little people begins to work against us as adults. So let's take the story of the Enneagram 1. We call them the improvers. And the broken story that ones tell themselves is that, for example, that good people are rewarded, bad people are punished. If I want to get my needs met, I have to perfect myself, others, and the world. That helped a little kid growing up to get their needs met, right? But when they get older, you know, perfectionism begins to work against you in your relationships, in your work. And so what I try to do is identify all 9 of those stories and challenge people to ask themselves, does this story serve me anymore? And if not, how can I rewrite my childhood story and transform it into one that makes sense for me as an adult?
How often in doing that do you come across people that didn't realize their childhood story, or didn't realize they were stuck in that kind of a story?
You know, it's a great question, and I love it because when I tell people about these broken stories, it's like I invented fire. They look at me like, oh my gosh, you're right. I have been imprisoned by a broken story, and it has been self-defeating, self-limiting, and Ian, you're showing me how I can break free from that old story and begin to live in one that, and again, I think I say this from the bottom of my heart, the kind of story God would have me inhabit.
And how can you break free? So you do talk about it, you kind of lay it out, but how in a brief sort of way, how can you break free from that? What's the work we do?
Yeah, well, I paint a 4-step journey, if you will, in the book, and it's based on the acronym SOAR, S-O-A-R. First thing is we got to see it. We have to know what that story is, and the book helps people articulate the old story, right? So you just have to begin to say, okay, that's the story, identify it. Next step is you got to own the story, meaning it's really important for us to own what the implications of that story are. How has it really hurt us as we've developed as people? Really own that. Then we have to awaken, right? How can I, in real time, awaken when that old story has taken hold of me again? And then the most beautiful part is, how do I rewrite the story? How do I begin the process of deconstructing the old story and replacing it with a new, generative, life-giving story that I really want to live?
If you're a perfectionist, perhaps you're afraid to try new things, and it's okay to try something and not do well at it.
Yes.
That's the kind of thing that you need to focus on.
Absolutely, and that would be one of many things that I would highlight and prescribe a new way of being in the world.
And so I look at all these stories, and they are childhood stories, and they're, again, each one of those things on the Enneagram, there's positive and there's stuff you need to work on. I look at it as now a parent. What should I be doing as a parent so that my kids aren't harmed in some way? Or they're going to be harmed in some way, it's just like, which one are you going to pick? You know what I mean? It's like
Sure.
Every one of these seems to happen with some sort of issue in childhood. And so what should we be thinking about as parents?
Yeah.
How can the Enneagram help us there?
Well, first off, people ask me the question all the time, at what age is it appropriate for me to begin working with the Enneagram and parenting? And I tell them, wait until late adolescence, because prior to that, the cement is wet, right? And it's important for us not to put our kids in a box, you know. I think in that late adolescence, they begin to have more clarity about who they are. But man, I gotta tell you something. I wish I'd known the Enneagram when my kids were growing up. You know, I wish I'd really understood them better than I did. And so, again, it's a wonderful tool for parents. And, you know, my kids know the Enneagram now. And as they like to tell me all the time, Dad, this has saved me time. It has saved me time and heartache. You know, it has helped me in my business. It's helped me in my relationship with my partner. It's a real eye-opener in so many ways.
Let's put up that graphic again that shows all the numbers. Mm-hmm. How long does it take to find out what you are? I think, again, my church was talking about this, and I kind of hadn't gotten into it because it takes some time. I finally did it when I was on vacation, and I was like, okay, this actually does work. Now, how long would it take to figure out what you are? You got to put some time into it.
Yes. Now, it doesn't, I mean, some people it takes more time than it does others. Strangely enough, back when I started working with the Enneagram, I'm a therapist, I'm a priest, you know, you'd think I would have nailed it super fast. Well, it took me months to really hone in on my type. But boy, when the penny dropped, wow, big things ahead for me at that moment, right? There's a couple of ways to do it. There's the story of you. There's a book I wrote previous to that called The Road Back to You, which is sort of a wonderful primer. I would say it doesn't take very long at all. And I have actually an assessment on my website called the IEQ9 that would help people do it as, you know, figure out their type as well. So it really depends on the person, but I'd say on average, not too long.
I was reading some stuff on it, and it says there's been some pushback in some circles, in faith circles. People that push back are likely to be older, likely to have first seen books on the Enneagram in the New Age section of the bookstore, and they think, is that what we're talking about here? If you hear pushback like that, you know, what do you say?
But, you know, it's so interesting. This book was widely reviewed in, you know, sort of the faith-based world, so Christianity Today, among others, right? I got so little pushback. I was actually quite amazed because, you know, as you said, people would say to me, is this the pentagram? And I'm like, no, 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 it's called the Enneagram, right? It's like, no, let's get that anxiety out of the way pretty fast, right? You know, a lot of times people are just anxious. You know, they don't want to, you know, kind of go into territory that might be inconsistent with their worldview. And I tell them, you know, look, this is rooted in a Christian tradition. There's nothing in it that's inconsistent with a Christian worldview. In fact, it's very supportive of it. And so again, you know, I can't tell you the number of churches and actually many very well-known pastors who have endorsed it and endorsed the work that I do. So fear not. Fear not,
yes. Give us an example of a story. In the book, you tell your story, you tell the story of several people, and you say we're all about stories. What's a story that really would hammer home to someone how this can be a useful tool?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you one that's a little dramatic. How's that? I heard through another Enneagram teacher who was leading a workshop that a man came up to her at the end of the day and said, I just found out that I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. Now, the 8s are called the challengers. They tend to be notoriously blunt. They can be aggressive. They love a good debate. My mother's an 8. She likes to say that she can start an argument in an empty house, you know? Yeah. So you get the type, right? Okay, right. And he discovered during the day, too, that his son was a 4. Now, they can't be much different, right? The 4 tends to be, 4s are like disproportionately represented in the arts, right? They're a softer type, and his son was a poet and a songwriter. And Dad was like, I haven't spoken to my son in 5 years because I, for all of his childhood, tried to make him a copy of me. And it just led to a break in the relationship. Well, he went home, called his son, and said, please come over, I have something to talk to you about. And they stayed up until 6 in the morning, and they had this beautiful reconciliation. Dad came out and said, I'm so sorry. Now I realize what I'm like, what you're like, and I just didn't let you be you, right? Now here comes the dramatic part. The man called the teacher 2 weeks later, and he said, my son was killed in a car accident last week. And he said, it's terrible news. However, if I hadn't learned the Enneagram, we would never have been reconciled to each other and understood each other. And so again, terrible story. Wow. However, there's a lot at stake, obviously, right? In understanding ourselves and understanding other people, it can reconcile marriages. It can reconcile, parents who have a strained relationship with children. I mean, gosh, there is such power in understanding who you are and appreciating the difference, right? That there are different ways of seeing the world and moving through the world and not judging them as abnormal because they're not like yours.
That's a big part of the world we live in now, the division in the world, political division. And can this help with that? Maybe, hopefully. How? Is there anything that you could offer in that realm?
Sure. Well, when I work with leaders, I often tell them the most egregious mistake that you can make is to presume that your way of seeing the world is normal, right? Because that means when you meet someone whose worldview is different than yours, you will feel justified in judging them as abnormal. So I think it's an appreciation of difference, right? It also, the Enneagram really arouses compassion. It arouses understanding. Now, you may continue to have differences, right? But I think the more we can understand other people, the more we can be with them in our differences and not allow opinions to become blocks to relationship.
That's fascinating. Don't assume your way of thinking is normal. We have a minute left. Where can people hear more? Yeah, this podcast, tell us about the podcast, the books, whatever you want to say here.
Sure. Well, The Road Back to You was my first in a series on the Enneagram. It's a great primer for people. Obviously, The Story of You is a wonderful place to start as well. My website is ianmorgancron.com. You can go there and download my assessment, the IEQ-9. Typology is my podcast. We now have over 20 million downloads. It's a show on which I interview people of different types, right, and talk about what it's like to live in their shoes. And when you hear it direct from someone else, it's a lot better than me describing it, right? It's very, very powerful. And
it's fascinating. We could talk so much longer, but Ian Morgan Cron, thank you so much for coming on. And thanks to all of you for watching Issues of Faith.